Hey everyone, a while back I covered the World's Finest miniseries from 1990. Today we're going to be reviewing that story and some thoughts I have about how it contrasts with the big Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice movie. Before we begin, be sure to subscribe to Comic Island for more recaps and reviews of all things comics. World's Finest is an interesting read. I picked out this series at random as part of a series of videos I've been doing on and off for the last little bit, where we look at random Joker comics. It's a fun thing I've done before to explore characters like Mary Jane Watson, or even a long single run of books like we did for Detective Comics. With the Joker, I've expanded things to look at full story arcs like World's Finest. But the cost is that these reviews are much more elaborate and complicated. It slows things down, and to balance it all out, I had taken a long, extended break from my initial run of random reviews for the Joker, and in the future we'll probably be doing these in shorter reps to reflect that. Regardless, it all works out, because a lot of these random Joker reviews feature some excellent stories overall. World's Finest is among them, a fun book, however strange it might be. This is not the clean-cut fun of other early adventures between Batman and Superman, like their famed encounter on that cruise ship early on. The heroes are real strangers to each other in this story, and it doesn't change much here. They never really even team up much. Instead, our creators, Dave Gibbons and Steve Rude, largely focus on the contrast between these two heroes as they go about independently confronting these related events. It feels like these characters don't know each other well, don't trust each other much, and rather than the story forcing the two together, we see how that relationship slowly changes over a period of time. That, in my opinion, works well for this miniseries. There are so many sweeping, glorious shots of Gotham and Metropolis that do a lot to visually contrast these two superheroes and the setting around them. When switching between the two characters, you can feel a palatable change in mood. There's a real difference in the atmosphere created for these two superheroes. Gibbons and Rude as artists are interesting here. Both are excellent in this regard, but I'm less familiar with their work as writers. I do like it though. They tend to almost underwrite World's Finest, deliberately focusing more on the tone of the story and the atmosphere we were talking about earlier. When you look at the overarching plot, though, there isn't much to it. Luthor and Joker kind of team up, but their plans never really amount to much, and their team-up sort of just falls apart to infighting. The whole story feels like it culminates in a pretty minor scuffle at the orphanage. It feels like the story doesn't really need or rely on some big, climactic ending, which is very refreshing. And though the action is sparse, it is present in all issues and well used. There's something deeply effective about Superman effortlessly taking out a couple of crooks, and comparing that to the much more difficult struggle with Batman against a turret gone out of control. There isn't much to the action in terms of it being these big elaborate set pieces, but when it is present, it is memorable. And that makes this short 3-issue series still feel like a superhero experience, without relying all that much on action at all. So we have a comic series that doesn't really have a big plot, so to speak, nor does it really rely on action much. The art is beautiful, but I don't think that would be big enough to carry World's Finest on its own. Instead, it feels like things take one step further with proper, well-formatted character work. The most obvious and important aspect of this is the relationship between Batman and Superman. Though cold and fraught with conflict at first, we clearly see how this might change. I just love the way Superman, largely out of coincidence, gives Batman the Zorro movie as a gift. It's a little bit of a stretch that something like that could happen, but it's worth it for that beautiful, quiet little moment between these two characters, and the very reflective beginnings of a new but critically important friendship to the DC Universe. In the time leading up to the Crisis of Infinite Earths, the original World's Finest series was cancelled. Batman, increasingly a dark, brooding character, just wasn't making sense beside Superman, with all the hope and idealism he still represented. It appears there was going to have been a time in DC history where these big two names in DC Comics were not going to be friends anymore. After that cancellation, the Crisis of Infinite Earths had effectively reset things for the DC universe. This created a unique opportunity where a lot of continuity was up in the air, and things like this friendship could be explored again, or even abandoned entirely. So a lot was riding on the World's Finest miniseries of 1990. It is very important as a comic in establishing that the old dynamic of the World's Finest, deliberately named after that original series, that friendship was not dead. Far from it. The whole point of these books is to show how people who might seem different, like Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent, fundamentally hold identical goals in their career as superheroes. Though their views and outlook on all this might differ a little bit, they can look past that and forge a true friendship because of these shared values. On those grounds, I think World's Finest does a fantastic job. That gift scene might be one of the best moments between Batman and Superman to date. I also really like how Luthor and the Joker are handled in this book. They are fun and, unlike Batman and Superman, really take to working together at first. In contrast to the heroes who come together over the course of this story, our villains break apart. Capped off very nicely with a moment where Luthor literally throws Joker out of his life at the very end of this story. It's an excellent dichotomy between our villains and heroes, servicing all four characters well in a short story that doesn't really have all of them doing that much to begin with, especially on our villain side. The whole mini-series is a bit of a tightrope walk, contrasting Batman and Superman against each other, as well as against their villains, who also conflict with one another, all the while not having some big overarching story to drive things forward, instead just focusing on some random stuff with an orphanage. Not all of it works perfectly, but for what it is, as a collection of really polished art that evokes classic Superman and Batman comics, while also really relishing in some great character moments, it definitely feels like a series worth your time, and I would recommend people check it out for themselves. So that's my review of this thing, although one thing that I did leave out that I'd like to talk about a little bit more now is how much this comic book series reminded me of Batman v Superman. While I certainly don't think every review needs to talk about film adaptation, it sure feels like that movie takes quite a few cues from World's Finest. The way it is structured around Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent meeting at a fancy event really comes to mind. But deeper than that, the movie was supposed to feature both Luthor and the Joker teaming up against Batman and Superman, just like in World's Finest. And instead we got the Luthor we got, a weird amalgamation of the Lex Luthor we know, with a lot of Joker mannerisms, behaviors, and attitudes inflected into the character at random. The shape of it all, when you start picking the movie apart, identifying moments where the Joker could have been more effective, starts to look a lot better than the actual movie itself. There's a ton of moments throughout where the Joker would have been far more of a character, and we absolutely would have benefited from Luthor and the Joker actually being involved in the final battle, instead of the movie randomly introducing Doomsday. When I focus on the parts of the movie that I like, or the parts that could have worked better if the Joker were involved, it starts to more resemble World's Finest. Meanwhile, reading World's Finest gave me an excellent picture of what Batman v Superman could have been. And I didn't like that part of the experience. It left me feeling really bummed out that this movie failed so badly. And don't get me wrong, World's Finest is far from perfect. I don't think everything about these books would translate perfectly to film. Adapting it absolutely merits change, but it does seem like the people behind the movie didn't understand what changes need to be made. When I talk about how Batman and Superman can kind of bond over shared values, the movie at its core continually shows how these two characters in the DCEU don't have the same values, and therefore there isn't that bridge of character development where the two can come together for the final battle or something like that. World's Finest does have some of the dark and dreary atmosphere of Batman v Superman, but it completely and exclusively reserves that for Gotham. Metropolis is bright and colorful, right alongside their resident superhero. So the comics aren't afraid to contrast these two characters and show differences between them, but it knows that it can't turn Batman into a crazy murderer because then Superman can't accept that as a partner. Of course, in the DCEU, Superman is also a murderer, and the two argue about this point for some reason. It's a messy, disorganized story, and the comics, in comparison, don't feel like that, even though there are questions you can ask of them about the orphanage and what the point of all that was. They don't really invite those questions nearly as much as Batman v Superman does about its crazy plot holes. Also, the comics aren't afraid of their own origins as goofy stuff for children, and so it isn't afraid to be a little silly sometimes itself. Batman v Superman, in contrast, feels like it's terrified people won't take it seriously at every waking moment, and in doing so, it makes the film more of a joke than World's Finest will ever be. I think about a scene like Batman murdering all those dudes in the movie, and contrast that with him battling a turret in the comics, and one just feels so much more effective than the other as a fight scene. There's real danger with the turret. It's firing bullets everywhere, but we're in the middle of a city, so there's a lot of civilians around. Fires are starting, Batman is much more vulnerable and weaker in the comics compared to what's established in the DCEU. There's all these problems Batman has to solve and navigate through without a lot of time or simple solutions at hand. He has to get close to the turret without getting shot in order to plant an explosive. A very difficult feat, but one that feels very Batman. This feels like it could be an exciting scene in a movie, but to film it, one would have to be very creative. You couldn't just pass off the scene to a bunch of stunt coordinators to block everything out, do a bunch of quick cuts, film a bunch of crazy action of people fighting and shooting each other or whatever. Instead, you're going to have to storyboard everything and carefully execute the sequence. Because there's only one turret. Everything's got to be very carefully coordinated across different takes and cuts so that it's all consistent. It would require a lot of planning and effort, the kind of thing that a multimedia giant blockbuster could do. But planning and effort, well, I know Zack Snyder has a lot of fans, but you need somebody at the helm pushing for it, and the people controlling the purse strings to stop meddling or slowing that person down. It's uncanny because I'm pretty sure nobody involved in the movie actually read these books. I mean, I could be wrong about that, and I really wish they had read the books. They should have. Luckily, though, it does mean that pretty much everything's on the table for a future Batman v Superman to basically do this comic book story, adapt it, and make it more interesting. And because, the comic wasn't perfect, it could probably use some work around the orphanage stuff and maybe get a cleaner ending. An adaptation for it would be welcome. And that's about it for this review. Sorry for ranting about Batman v Superman, but it was literally all I could think of when reading these books. And I just had to talk about that for a little bit. Next up, though, in Random Reviews for the Joker, we're going into an alternate universe story, which is pretty damn fun. Stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time here on Comic Island.